Imagine moving to a dreamy Scandinavian town for your dream internship, only to discover your landlord is a controlling, messy hypocrite with a wet dog obsession and a hoarding problem. You pay rent, follow her endless rules, and still get scolded like a naughty child. But what happens when you've had enough? This is the story of how I went from polite tenant to petty legend without getting caught. Buckle up, because this revenge is as passive-aggressive as a Swedish winter is long. Moving to Sweden sounded like the start of a dream. I just landed a cool internship unpaid, of course, because character development, and I was buzzing with excitement. New country, new opportunities, IKEA everywhere. What could go wrong? Turns out a lot. Because in Sweden, trying to do anything as a newcomer is like playing real-life Sims on hardcore mode. Want a phone plan? You need a Swedish bank ID. Want to get a bank ID? You need a Swedish bank account. Want a bank account? Well, you need a personal number and permanent address. It is like a snake eating its own tail end. I was just trying to find a place to sleep that didn't cost me a kidney. So I hunted online for anything remotely affordable within an hour of Göteborg. After weeks of rejections and dead ends, I found one ad that didn't require a bank ID. Hallelujah. The price? Euro 340 a month, all inclusive. For a 10 square meters room in a town of about 10,000 people, pretty far out, but manageable by train. I was too exhausted to question whether that was steep for the area. I just needed a roof. I hopped on a quick video call with the landlord, a woman who seemed particular but polite. The connection was choppy, and she only showed me the kitchen for about 10 seconds. At the time, I didn't think much of it. The room looked all right. A little bland, maybe, with a strange child's drawing taped to the wall and some suspicious wall stains that gave someone tried to DIY art vibes. But hey, it was furnished, had a bed, and I could finally stop living out of a suitcase. I said yes. The day I moved in, reality hit like a Swedish winter wind. The room was not clean. Dust bunnies under the bed, questionable marks on the wall, and the bathroom looked like it hadn't seen bleach in a year. But the real horror, that kitchen. From the moment I walked in, my soul shriveled. Imagine opening a cupboard and being greeted by an avalanche of expired spices, dog food, and some mystery Tupperware with life growing in it. Crumbs covered the counters, and the air was a mix of wet dog and despair. There was 1 square meter of usable counter space, and the rest was chaos. I didn't even have a drying rack. The pans were so caked in burnt food they looked like archaeological artifacts. I should have turned around right there and booked a hostel, but I didn't, because I was tired. Because I had nowhere else. Because deep down I thought maybe I was being dramatic. Turns out I wasn't, but that's a story for the next chapter. You know that moment when your brain registers a smell before your eyes can fully adjust? That was my first real introduction to the kitchen. I stepped in with my IKEA starter pack cutlery and froze. The stench hit like a slap. Sharp, earthy, and unmistakably wet dog. I wasn't sure if there was a dog, but if so, it was clearly winning the territorial war. Visually, it didn't get any better. The floor was a sticky patchwork of old spills and fur. Every surface seemed to be in a committed relationship with crumbs. The countertops were so crowded with random objects, jars, open boxes of cereal, dishes, a bag of dry dog food just chilling there like Decker that I could barely find a place to set my water bottle down. I finally spotted about 1 square meter of free counter space, but even that was flanked by utensils crusted over with what I can only assume was the ghost of meals past. The pans, my God, the pans, they were stored in the oven. The oven. Why? Because the cupboards were already full of chaos and other unidentifiable kitchen relics. And these weren't just well-loved pans, these things had layers. Carbonized, charred food fused with metal, looking like some dystopian non-stick experiment gone rogue. You could chip off a corner and send it to a lab for dating. If you told me these pans predated IKEA, I would have believed you. The fridge was packed in a way that made it impossible to tell what belonged to whom. Some items had clearly been in there since before I crossed the border. Moldy lemons. Half-eaten jars of mystery sauce. One thing actually hissed when I moved it. And don't get me started on the smell when you opened that door. I learned to hold my breath and work fast. At first, I thought maybe this was just post-move-in chaos. Like maybe she hadn't had time to tidy up or do a deep clean before I arrived. But a few days passed and nothing changed. No cleanup effort, no magical improvement. This was the status quo. I started to realize the house was basically running on passive neglect. Meanwhile, I kept thinking about the price, €340 a month for this. Colleagues at the internship later told me I was getting ripped off, especially considering I was living an hour outside Göteborg. But at the time, I hadn't known any better, and by the time I figured it out, I was already a few weeks in with nowhere else to go. So I told myself to be grateful. I had a roof. I had a bed. I had a door I could close. It wasn't ideal, but it was temporary. Besides, this was a cultural experience, right? A lesson in independence? Some kind of character arc? That internal dialogue worked for maybe a week. But the longer I stayed, the more the filth got under my skin, literally and metaphorically. I found myself cleaning before I cooked just to feel safe. I bought my own sponge, my own dish soap, even my own fork, just so I wouldn't have to touch anything communal. I cooked meals in awkward silence while trying not to gag from the smell or bump into one of her hoarded piles of stuff. The irony? For all this mess, I still felt like I was the intruder. Like somehow I was the one disrupting her system, even though her system was barely functioning. It was like entering someone's chaotic universe where you had to tiptoe around their nonsense and pretend it was normal. And the worst part was, I didn't feel like I could complain. I was a guest, technically. I didn't want to seem ungrateful or dramatic. I told myself to keep my head down, focus on the internship, and avoid conflict. But deep down, the resentment was building. Because this wasn't just a messy house. It was a deliberately messy house run by someone who had rules. A lot of them. And as I was about to learn, those rules only applied to me. At first, I thought the landlord just liked things her way. I can deal with that. Everyone has preferences, especially in shared spaces. But then the rules started piling up, and I realized I wasn't just a tenant in her house. I was an unwilling contestant on some twisted version of landlord's got control issues. It began subtly. She'd mention things like, everything you borrow in the kitchen should be washed and put back in the right place immediately. Reasonable. If the kitchen wasn't already a crusty mess with zero system, filled to the brim with mismatched everything. I never waited more than 24 hours to clean up, and honestly, with the mess that was already there, I thought I was doing her a favor by not rushing to reintroduce my clean dish into the biohazard zone. Also, she had 20 duplicates of every item. If I used a spoon or bowl and didn't return it immediately, it's not like she was stranded. And let's be real. How can you demand items be returned to their right place when your version of storage is stuff it anywhere there's airspace? The woman stored her pans in the oven. I rest my case. Things escalated with the sponge incident. One day, I went into the kitchen and my sponge was just done. I figured maybe she threw it out by accident, so I messaged her. Her reply? She moved it to a random cupboard and said from now on I needed to take it back to my room after every use. Like I was in some kind of secret sponge smuggling operation. The next day, she placed my sponge and my bottle of dish soap on the stairs, like I'd been evicted from the kitchen. That dish soap had been there for 3 weeks before she even noticed it. Which to me screamed, it wasn't bothering her until she was looking for something to scold me about. It didn't stop there. One time I used a mixing bowl and left it to dry next to the sink because, reminder, she doesn't have a drying rack. She messaged me later saying, "Don't leave that bowl there, I never use it and it takes up space." Fair enough. Except a week later, she found that same bowl in our tiny upstairs cupboard and went ballistic. She accused me of hogging it, even though she had 3 other identical ones in the downstairs kitchen. I couldn't win. Leave it out to dry. Problem. Tuck it away neatly upstairs. Still a problem. And let's talk about the passive-aggressive messages. She never just said things directly. It was always these condescending little notes or texts that started with, "Hi, just wanted to remind you," and ended with something petty like, "We don't leave forks in the sink because it attracts bacteria." Meanwhile, her dog food sat open on the counter for days, and she had dried spaghetti stuck to a burner like modern art. She once messaged me to complain that a single spoon I'd washed wasn't tea in the cutlery drawer, but was sitting in the drying area upstairs. This, in a house where you had to move a stack of papers just to find a clean knife. It wasn't about cleanliness. It was about control. Then came the snooping. I caught her creeping around our upstairs kitchenette more than once. Once I heard the stairs creak and came out to find her mid-rummage through our cupboard. Her excuse? Just checking on things. No warning, no boundaries, just nosing into our space like a suburban detective. That's when I started to get paranoid, like, was she cataloging what I ate, tracking my sponge movements? Did she have a spreadsheet titled Foreign Intern Crimes? All of this micromanagement would have been barely tolerable if she'd at least led by example. But no, she was the queen of double standards. She left greasy pans soaking in the sink for days. Her dog tracked mud into the hallway and she didn't clean it for a week. Her hoarding turned every drawer into a game of what even is this? And don't even get me started on the mysterious smell wafting from under the sink. I tried to keep my cool. I really did. I told myself she's probably going through something. Maybe she's overwhelmed. Maybe she's just not self-aware. But when you're paying actual money to live in what feels like a biohazard zone, only to be treated like a toddler who can be trusted with a dish towelette starts to wear you down. And the worst part, I couldn't say anything. Not directly. If I complained, she'd probably find a way to evict me. And finding a new place without a bank ID? Forget it. So I smiled. I nodded. I moved my sponge, but inside, a storm was brewing. A very petty, very calculated storm. There's always that one moment, the final straw. The thing that tips you from, I can handle this, into, nope, I'm done. For me, it was the dish soap on the stairs. After everything, the crusty kitchen, the hoarding, the sponge exile, the micromanaging, I thought I'd developed a thick skin. My sponge, perched like a tiny hostage, sitting there with my half-used bottle of dish soap on the stairs. As if to say, here's your property. Kindly remove it from the Queen's domain. I stood there for a full minute, staring. Not because I was shocked, it wasn't even surprising at this point, but because something inside me just snapped. I told myself to breathe through the passive-aggressive texts, to laugh off the ridiculous rules, numb, done, to remember I was in Sweden for a good reason, and that none of this was permanent. But then one morning I opened my door and saw it. If she wanted to play the petty game, I'd play it better, cleaner, subtler, with a smile. I was going to be the perfect tenant on the surface. But behind the scenes, I was going full stealth mode. Not enough to get me kicked out. Just enough to shake her grip. Just enough to reclaim a tiny sliver of control in a situation where I had none. I had spent weeks trying to be respectful, flexible, low maintenance. I didn't expect luxury. I just wanted basic dignity. But unlike the usual impulsive tantrums, I knew this had to be a slow burn, a chess game. No direct confrontations, no risk of eviction. Just small moves that would unsettle her and restore my peace, one subtle jab at a time. You feel like you're walking on eggshells in a house made of landmines. And all you can do is tiptoe and hope you don't set one off. If I did, I'd risk getting kicked out. And I knew damn well that finding a new place mid-internship without a bank ID would be next to impossible. And yet, despite everything I tolerated, I was being treated like I didn't belong in a space I was literally paying for. I picked up the sponge, I picked up the soap, and I went back to my room, not angry in the traditional sense, but hollow. That moment broke me, not because of what it was, but what it represented. Worse, I felt powerless. I couldn't argue. Couldn't threaten to leave. Couldn't go scorched earth and call her out. That's the emotional toll. No one talks about when you in someone else's territory. One morning I took the worst pan, the one crusted like it could be a fossil, and accidentally stored it in the attic space above the garage. When she inevitably started hunting for it, I could feign innocence. I started putting tiny sticky notes on my food and utensils with timestamps, like, I haven't seen that pan in weeks, maybe it's hiding somewhere. The confusion would gnaw at her, and the oven would be just slightly less apocalyptic. But somewhere in that numbness, something shifted. A little flicker of fire lit up. Not rage. Not despair. Something smaller, sharper. The notes were friendly, but the message was crystal clear, and nobody could accuse me of being rude, pettiness, because if I couldn't fight back outright, I'd fight back smart. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to stoop to her level. If she touched my stuff, I'd have evidence she was violating my space in, who knows. She took one look at the kitchen and gasped audibly, "Oh my God, how do you even survive here? This is gross." I pretended to be embarrassed, but I could see the seed of doubt sprout in the landlord's eyes when she overheard. The kitchen remained a mess, sure, but now I was in the driver's seat, at least a little. Every misplaced pan, every note, every switched sponge was a tiny rebellion, a secret smile to myself that I was winning. It was subtle but effective. When your guest voices what you've been thinking, it makes the mess impossible to ignore. The landlord, once so confident and controlling, started to seem off, uneasy. She'd pause longer when entering the kitchen, scanning for her missing carbonized pan or the unauthorized mixing bowl mysteriously drying upstairs. I caught her glancing suspiciously at the sticky notes I'd left behind, reading them with a tight-lipped smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Like a cat who knocked over a priceless vase and was now pretending she didn't. She couldn't legitimately call me out without exposing her own hypocrisy. Every tiny victory fueled my sanity and gave me the strength to keep going. I no longer felt powerless. About reclaiming my space in a way she couldn't touch. Looking back, living with that landlord was a wild ride, a mix of frustration, weirdness, and unexpected lessons. At first, I felt like a victim in someone else's messy drama, trapped in a house that smelled like wet dog and broken boundaries. The absurdity of a sponge exile drama, it made the whole thing less overwhelming and more bearable. Laughing at the madness helped me keep my sanity. But over time, I realized it was so much more than that. I was no longer the scared tenant tiptoeing around a mess. It's the small, smart moves that protect your peace and let you take back control one sticky note at a time. Living with a nightmare landlord didn't break me, it refined me. I learned that sometimes the sweetest revenge is subtle, strategic, and absolutely anonymous. No screaming matches, no confrontations. Just the slow, satisfying burn of making your control freak landlord question her reality. If you enjoyed this petty little saga, hit that like button, subscribe for more revenge stories. And remember, when life gives you a crusty pan in the oven, give mint on the windowsill. I learned that you don't always need to confront head-on to reclaim your space. Sometimes the quiet, calculated moves make the biggest impact. Boundaries aren't just about words, they're about actions, about showing up with dignity and a little bit of sass. I was the petty queen who quietly ruled the chaos. I'd catch her muttering under her breath about that sponge mystery or complaining about where my food labels keep coming from. The once confident queen of the kitchen was reduced to a frazzled caretaker trying to plug holes in a sinking ship. I left knowing I had navigated a tricky situation with grace and a touch of humor. I wasn't just a powerless tenant, I was a strategist. A petty queen who could hold her ground without losing her cool, that quiet pride in my stealth revenge. It was empowering. It reminded me that even in tough situations I could find ways to win. Every attempt to catch me backfired because there was nothing to catch. Meanwhile, her own mess became even harder to ignore, especially with the notes gently calling her out, and guests whispering behind her back. Maybe she'd think twice before borrowing my items without asking. My mission was clear: restore my sanity through strategic, anonymous acts of passive resistance. She'd put the sponge back in the random cupboard, only to find it swapped again overnight. She'd shuffle kitchen utensils, only to discover they'd been carefully relabeled or relocated by me. She tried sending me friendly reminders about my dishwashing schedule, but I was always a step ahead, polite and spotless in my routines. I got a small pot of mint and left it on the kitchen windowsill. Mint grows fast and smells great, perfect for masking odors. But more importantly, I let it spread a bit beyond its pot, creeping onto the counter here and there. The landlord didn't notice at first, but after a few weeks, she started commenting on the weird plant that was taking over her kitchen. Just a tiny bit of natural chaos to remind her that not all disorder is controlled by her. I started making dishes with bold, lingering aromas. Think garlic-heavy pasta, spiced curry, and slow-cooked stews. The smells spread and clung to her precious clutter like a cheeky ghost. Every time she complained about the wet dog smell, I smiled inside. Because now my cooking was part of the war, and the scent was mine. Every time she hid my sponge or dish soap, I'd discreetly switch it with one of hers. Eventually, she couldn't tell which sponge was mine and which was hers. When she moved one, the other magically appeared somewhere else. It was harmless, but utterly disorienting for someone so obsessed with control. Plus, I finally had a legitimate excuse to roll my eyes whenever she lost her cleaning supplies. The storm had officially begun. So there I was, fresh from the breaking point, with my petty revenge mode activated. First up, the polite notes. I printed tiny sticky notes with sweet, disarming messages like, "Please remember to remove expired dog food from the counter. Let's keep shared spaces tidy, thanks so much." Reminder, wet dog smell doesn't mix well with kitchen vibes. Leaving these in the kitchen felt like sending little diplomatic peacekeepers to patrol her chaos. Next, I went for the classic misplaced carbonized pan trick. Then came my personal favorite, the sponge swap, feeling inspired by the success of these small moves. I stepped up my game with over-labeling. Do not touch, last checked. The 9th of July 2025, 1932. Property of my name. Please respect. I made it look official, like I was running a scientific lab rather than a shared kitchen. It was petty, yes. But it also firmly marked my territory. The kitchen was still a battlefield, but I realized I had one more weapon, cooking smells. Then I added a social twist, inviting a friend over. I was cautious, not too often, not too loudly, but one afternoon I had a clean, tidy friend visit. Finally, as a bonus move, I started a stealth plant project. All these moves were small and polite on the surface, but packed a powerful punch underneath. And the best part? She had no idea. After weeks of my carefully orchestrated petty campaign, the first cracks began to show, not in me, but in her. At first, the signs were subtle. Then came the small power plays, all attempts to regain the upper hand, but they fizzled out almost immediately. It was as if her iron grip had been loosened by invisible threads, and every time she tried to tighten it, the fabric slipped further through her fingers. What was most satisfying? I was polite, I was clean. I was respectful. I followed her rules better than she did herself. Her mood shifted too, from passive-aggressive control freak to visibly flustered. And through it all, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: peace. I wasn't just surviving the situation, I was thriving within it. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic showdowns. It was about subtle, sustained power. For the first time since moving in, I looked around that messy kitchen and thought, I've got this. This experience taught me the power of setting my own limits, even when I didn't have much control over my environment. I found humor in the chaos, the irony of a landlord demanding spotless dishes while her pans were fossilized. More importantly, I discovered how resilient and clever I could be. So, while the house might never have been perfectly clean, and the kitchen still smelled like a wet dog's secret lair, I left feeling stronger. If you ever find yourself stuck in a less-than-ideal living situation, remember, sometimes the best revenge isn't loud or confrontational.